Hey everyone, Dorian from Noesis here. It's great to see you again. Today, we'll be learning how to easily blur one element with another, all directly within Noesis Studio. The technique that we'll be using leverages a powerful subset of function adding features known as behaviors, and in this exercise, we'll be creating a HUD notification badge, which will then apply a background effect behavior to, which we can then use to blur the area directly behind it, following its exact shape. Now all you'll need to follow along are the following. Any 1920 by 1080 PNG image to use as a background, any 512 by 512 semi-transparent PNG image to use as the badge's icon, and of course, the latest version of Noesis Studio. Once that's all ready to go, let's begin. As our very first step, we're going to create a directory in Windows Explorer where our project will live. We'll call this new folder Background Blur. We'll then go ahead and pop into it and create a subfolder, which we'll call Assets. We'll then grab the two PNG images we prepared and place them inside. Next, we'll open up the Noesis Studio launcher and hit the blue Create New button in the upper right of the window. We'll first ensure that we're in the root of the project directory we created for this exercise. Then, we'll name our project Background Blur and hit Create Project. This will launch our new project in Noesis Studio and we can now start building. To create the page in which we'll be working, let's go ahead and click on the plus icon on the right of the Assets panel. From there, we'll then select New Page. This will create a new page in our project, which we can then just take a moment to rename to mainpage.xaml. With our page created, let's now start setting up our elements. First, we'll just go ahead and double click on our root grid in the page and rename it to master_grid. Then, we'll pop over to the Add Element panel on the left of the screen, which you can also access by hitting Ctrl and 2 on the keyboard. At the top of this panel, we'll do a search for the image element. Once found, we'll drag an instance into our page's grid, and we'll then rename it to background_image. Next, we'll go ahead and populate this element with our background image by navigating to its properties panel on the right of the screen, and from its source property, selecting the desired asset. Next, we'll create a group in which all of our badge elements will live. So, we'll head back to the Add Element panel and this time search for a grid element. And just like we did before, once we've found it, we'll click and drag an instance into our master grid. And we'll immediately rename it to badge_grid. We'll then head over to its properties and start preparing it for the content we'll be populating it with. We'll start by unlocking our margins to be able to set them as individual values in each quadrant. Then, we'll set our margins to 0, 0, 80, 0. We'll then set our horizontal alignment to center, and our vertical alignment to top. This will give us a layout where our badge will be 80 pixels from the top center of the page. We'll then just go ahead and add a drop shadow effect too by navigating to the effect property and selecting drop shadow effect from the list. Since this grid doesn't have any content at the moment, the shadow won't render just yet, but we'll still go ahead and configure it so that once we start building our badge, it'll automatically apply. We'll start by setting a color of FF124C7A. Then we'll set a direction of -90, an opacity of 50%, a blur radius of 24, and a shadow depth of 64. With that all prepared, let's now move on to building the shape of our badge. To do so, we're going to use a star shape as a base, then modify it into a triangle. So from the Add Element panel, we'll now do a search for the star element. And we'll then drag this into our navigator into our newly created badge_grid. We'll then just go ahead and rename this to badge_blur. We're naming it this way because this is the element that will, as the name implies, blur our background. We'll then just pop over to its properties and set its width to 800, its height to 800, its count to 3, its ratio to 0.5, and its radius to 32. And there we have it, we've procedurally made a triangle out of a star. Now one thing you may have noticed is that although we have a 3-pointed star, we have a gap at the bottom of its bounding box. This is because this element is still technically a star that would normally fill that bottom space, but in our case, we've essentially trimmed out its bottom points to make a triangle. So to make our bounding box represent the shape's actual footprint, we're going to right click on our star, and from the path section of its context menu, we'll select Convert to Path. If we switch to the Direct Selection tool, which you can access by pressing A on the keyboard, you can see that this shape is now made up of paths and points. And if we switch to our selection tool using V on the keyboard, we can also see that the gap that used to be in the star is now present as a bottom margin, which we can easily clear from the properties panel. However, before we do that, we're just going to flip this triangle vertically to create an inverted pyramid shape. So with the element selected, we'll head over to its properties panel and we'll scroll down to the transform section. And under the render transform's rotate transform tab, we'll set a value of 180. Nice. Lastly, we're just going to set this rotation as its new native appearance. What I mean by this is that we'll essentially be setting this current orientation to be treated as unrotated. This can be really useful, for example, if you want to rotate the element in an animation, you'd simply be able to input your desired rotation value rather than having to add or subtract from the current 180-degree rotation. So to accomplish this, we're going to right-click once again on badge_blurrer, and from its path context menu category, we'll select flatten transform, and that'll do it. At this point, just some final touches. First, let's go ahead and finally clear that bottom margin. To do so, we'll hover over any of the margin property fields and press the middle mouse button, which will clear the margins of their local values. Then, we're just going to add a transparent stroke of 00, 00, 00, 00, and set its thickness to 2. We're adding this in because we'll be superimposing an overlay layer with a 2-pixel visible stroke later in the exercise, and this will ensure that both superimposed elements share the exact same footprint. Now we get to dive into the wonderful world of behaviors, where we'll get to add the functionality that will see this triangle blur the background behind it. We'll head over to the far left of the screen and open the Interactivity tab, which you can also access by hitting Ctrl and 3 on the keyboard. Then we'll head over to the Behaviors tab. An element needs to be selected to apply a behavior to it, so we'll first just ensure that badge_blurrer is selected. Then we'll click on the plus icon in the top right of the Behaviors tab and select Background Effect Behavior from the list. We'll then head over to the Behaviors properties on the right of the application window and we'll hover over its source property. From there, we'll click on its 3-dot menu and select Create Binding. The source, in this case, represents the element that we want to be the target of the blurring. So in this case, our background_image. So we'll head over to the Name tab of the binding menu to be able to point to it by name. We'll just ensure that background image is selected under the element name, and then we'll select all of the text present in the path properties field and delete all of it. This will make the source target the entire element and not just one of its properties. Then, from the effect property, we'll select Blur Effect and give it a radius of 128. And you'll immediately see that our triangle is now blurring the background behind it. Super cool. Now for a few extra points, although we've achieved creating our background blur effect successfully, let's take some time to stylize this badge even further. In particular, let's create an overlay that will tint the blurred area with both a semi-transparent fill as well as an opaque outline. We'll use our badge blurrer as a base for our second shape, so we'll right click on it from the navigator and from the edit section of its context menu, we'll select duplicate. We'll immediately rename our duplicate to badge_overlay. Now one thing you may have noticed is that when we duplicated our element, the behavior we created earlier also duplicated. This is because behaviors are bound to the elements they're applied to. Now we only need our badge blurrer to do the blurring, and it already does. So from the Behaviors tab, we can simply delete the behavior associated with the badge overlay by hovering over it and clicking on the trash icon. With that done, we're now able to reclaim our fill property to display a color rather than the visual brush that the behavior created for it. So we'll click on the fill property, click on the solid color brush tab, then change our value to 3F, 12, 4C, 7A to give us a dark blue with transparency. We'll then also edit the strokes value and change it to FF, 12, 4C, 7A to give us a fully opaque version of the blue we used on the fill. Now at this point, you may have noticed that between the blur and the overlay, we've only changed their fill and stroke properties whilst keeping their physical forms identical. However, one potential consideration of them being duplicates is that we can see, for example, that if we modify the path of the overlay, the blur doesn't adjust alongside it, meaning that any shape changes would need to be made twice, once in the overlay and once in the blur. One really cool thing we can do, however, is to configure them to have the overlay always mirror the form of the blur so that they move in tandem. So let's go ahead and select Badge Overlay, and we're going to create a few bindings. We'll start with the data property, which is the property that contains the vector values which dictate the actual shape of the triangle made up of its points and segments. So we'll hover over the data field, and from its 3-dot menu, we'll select Create Binding. Then we'll head to the Name tab. There, we'll select Badge Blurrer from the Element Name menu, and then under Path, we'll select Data. And we'll repeat the exact same process for the Width property, but this time selecting the width from the list of available paths. And lastly, we'll repeat the same process once more, but for the Height property. Now, if we select our Badge Blurrer element and switch to our Direct Selection tool using A on the keyboard, we can see how adjusting the point position in our blurrer also does the exact same on our Overlay element. Using this technique, any changes to our badge shape now only need to be performed on a single element and will reflect across any elements set to mirror its shape and dimensions. For our very last touch, we're now going to add a bit of visual flair to our badge and bring in our iconography. We'll start by heading to the Add Element panel and searching for the image element. Once found, we'll drag it into our badge grid just under both of our shapes, and we'll immediately rename this to icon_image. We'll then head right over to its properties panel, and from the source property, we'll select our icon. Then we'll set our width to 360, our margins to individual, and then set our margin values to 0, 0, -128, 0 to optically align our icon within the triangle. Then we'll give this a nice shadow by heading down to Effect and adding a drop shadow effect. We'll set its color to FF, 12, 4C, 7A, its direction to -90, its blur radius to 24, and finally its shadow depth to 32. And that's looking rather nice, isn't it? And that's all it takes to achieve this sort of visual effect in your interfaces. It's super powerful, highly flexible, and can be equally used for style just as much as for legibility. Now, of course, this behavior is also something that can be used in the context of animation, allowing you to take full advantage of its offerings in motion. So, lots of excitement and a lot of neat new things to try out. We hope you found this useful. As always, if you have any questions or want to share something you've made, drop by our forums anytime. We always love to hear from you. Thanks so much again for joining, and we'll see you next time.